very warm welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. Welcome to the ITIL Foundation Webinar 2021. My name is Anand, and I'll be your presenter for today. To give you a very brief introduction about myself, I am a certified ITIL expert trainer and a consultant. I've been working in the industry for over a decade, and I'm a certified ITIL V3 expert and an ITIL 4 managing professional. So that's a very brief introduction about myself. Now, before we get started with this webinar, I'd like to lay down a few ground rules. All of you would be in the listen only mode during this webinar. We will be having a live Q&A section. So once I'm done talking about the webinar and all the ITIL topics, you will get an opportunity to post your questions, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible during this webinar. So feel free to share your questions during the session. We'll be answering them shortly. Without any further ado, let's get started on the topic of ITIL. So today we're going to be talking about how relevant is ITIL for in 2021? What is ITIL for and how it is different from Agile and DevOps? There's a question a lot of people have in their mind. How is ITIL different from something like an Agile certification or a DevOps? So I'm going to briefly talk about that. How ITIL and Agile work together. What is the current industry outlook for ITIL 4? How you can build your career in ITIL 4 as an organization, as an individual, how ITIL 4 can help you, the various certification paths, and then we'll have plenty of time for a question and answer section. So this is the agenda for today. Let me start by talking about what is ITIL. Now, many of you may be familiar with ITIL. You may have done previous certifications. While some of you, I understand, might be very new to the ITIL world and maybe wondering what ITIL is all about and whether this is something for you or not. So let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. What is ITIL? Well, in order to understand what is ITIL, we have to go back to the future, back to the early 1980s when it all started. So you may be wondering, 1980s, wow, that's quite far behind. Why didn't I realize that ITIL is more than 4 decades old? Well, that's a question we often hear from people. That ITIL, is it really 4 decades old? Yes, it is almost 4 decades old. It started in early 1980s as a project by the British government. So it was a government project in UK, and they sent out a group of consultants to start collecting various best practices from various different industries. And this is when the need for ITIL basically emerged. In the version 1, which was released in 1980s, there was 30 plus books that were released under the title ITIL V1 or version 1. Now, at this point of time, British government was the only kind of a stakeholder involved in the ITIL. Other countries or other organizations, no one would have heard of ITIL, and this was the beginning of it. Fast forward to early 1990s. This is when ITIL acceptance started spreading worldwide, and outside of the government organization, people started utilizing ITIL as a framework. What a framework is and what it is all about, we're going to be talking about that shortly. Just taking you through the history of ITIL basically. Move on to 2000s. This is when a major shift happened, when Microsoft used ITIL as a basis to develop its own framework called as Microsoft Operations Framework. And that was a major shift for the world, because this is when various different organizations started adopting. So I would say somewhere between 1990s and 2000, there was a big shift. Many large organizations started utilizing ITIL as a basic for managing their IT service management. Over the course of years, there have been multiple updates to ITIL in 2007, 2011, with the latest update that happened in 2019. So this is a significant update that came out after a gap of 8 years. So until 2019 April, when ITIL 4 was launched, we were on ITIL version 3, or sometimes it is called as V3 2011 or just 2011. This version was due for an update because there are a lot of changes that have happened in the industry. One of the major shifts that have happened in the industry, as all of you are aware in the past few years, is a shift towards agile, DevOps, and lean. These concepts have become very popular in the industry, and organizations are moving towards agile, DevOps, and lean. So ITIL V3 or 2011 was not designed to work. It was designed in a time when agile and DevOps were still maybe in a very basic stage or not being used much. But today, every organization is talking about agile, DevOps, and lean. So there was a need for an update, which is exactly what happened in 2019. So this ITIL 4 was launched in 2019, which is in alignment with concepts such as agile, DevOps, and lean. And we're going to talk about that more in some time. So this is how the history of ITIL looks like. As I said, some of you may be surprised to know that this is more than 3 decades or almost 4 decades old framework. So many people have not heard of ITL, even though it is quite old. And just to give you some insights, majority of the top 500 companies or Fortune 500 companies, in fact, more than 90% of the top 500 companies use ITIL as a framework, use ITL to manage their IT service management. That is how popular and widespread it is. If we talk about today, okay. Now, when we say ITIL, what is ITL? So I talked about the history of ITIL just now, but that still does not give you an indication of what ITIL is all about. So let me talk about that. ITL, we refer to ITL as a collection or set of best practices. Now, what is a best practice? Any practice that has a proven outcome and any practice that is widely accepted. So when we say widely accepted, we are generally talking global acceptance, can be referred to as a best practice. So again, so what do we mean by a proven outcome? That means these are the practices that have been tried and tested in various different organizations over the course of years. And these practices have provided consistent results. Anything that we follow and over a period of time, if it becomes a success, we call that as a best practice. The only difference is we are saying that these best practices have been accepted widely or globally by the entire world or the entire all the organization or majority of the organizations of the world. So ITIL is a collection of practices that have a proven outcome and they have been widely accepted. So I'm going to talk more about that shortly. For example, Lean, Six Sigma, DevOps, COVID, Agile, and many more. All these frameworks or practices have contributed towards the creation of ITIL. So when you do an ITIL training or a certification, you're learning bits and pieces of all these concepts. Or we can say all these different frameworks have contributed towards creation of what we refer to as ITIL today. For example, as I said, ITIL 4 is very much in alignment with Agile and DevOps. So it's not that you're going to learn entirely what Agile and DevOps is during an ITIL training, but some basics are definitely involved while talking about ITIL. Moving on. See, when we talk about ITIL, we basically use three keywords: best practices, which we have just talked about. Next is a framework and a set of guidelines or recommendation. We have talked about best practices. Let's talk about framework. What is a framework? We refer to ITIL as a framework. Now, some of you are wondering, what is a framework? Well, to explain it simply, if you have ever seen construction of a building happening, this is how a construction typically looks like. We have a foundation laid at the beginning. After the foundation is laid, we build the outer skeleton structure, which kind of serves as the fundamental strength of the building. It provides the integrity to the building, it provides a fundamental structure. Without this structure, the building itself would not have the necessary strength or the integrity. So the outer structure or the skeleton structure is what we call as framework. Similar to this, ITL provides us with a framework for managing our processes. It helps us build a basic skeleton structure. Now, this structure is essential for you as an organization and as an individual to manage your IT services. ITL, we can say, provides the necessary base for an organization to manage its IT services. Now, if you look at the framework, it does not look like a complete picture. If you look at the picture of the building, what I'm showing right on the screen, it does not look complete in any way, but it is very necessary. Similarly, ITL is not a step-by-step guideline. It does not provide a step-by-step guideline on how to run your processes. Rather, ITIL aims at providing you with the basics and fundamentals on how to run and manage your IT services. So it may look incomplete, but just like the outer structure for building is necessary to provide the strength. Similarly, ITIL is necessary for managing your IT services. This is an analogy that we can look at. So a framework is a foundation on which something is built. So what ITIL provides you basically is a foundation on which you can build your processes. It is a skeleton structure that provides the integrity. We have already talked about that. Now it looks incomplete, as I said. A framework never looks complete. That's not the objective of a framework. The objective of a framework is to provide the basic fundamentals, the foundations on which you can build. So we have talked about best practices and what is a framework. Next, let's talk about what are guidelines. So we also say that ITIL provides us with a number of guidelines or recommendations. What are these guidelines? If you have a look on the screen and on the right hand side under Facebook, you see statements like avoid peak time, less but better, consider boosting. These statements can be seen as recommendations. If you just read these statements, they are not forcing you to follow. For example, they are not saying don't travel in peak time or don't post in peak time. You should post less. The statements are more towards leaning towards suggestion than a rule. They are more like a recommendation. On the other hand, if you look at the left hand side, be responsive, be consistent. It is more like a rule. So guidelines, when we talk about any guideline, it can either be a rule or it can be a recommendation. Rules are meant to be followed. You cannot ignore it. You have to follow it. Recommendations you can choose to follow if you feel like, or you can modify the recommendations, or you can completely ignore them. It entirely depends on you. So when we say ITIL is a set of guidelines, basically ITIL provides us with a list of recommendations. These recommendations have been collated over these past 4 decades through the experience of many different industry experts. So we know that these recommendations work, but we also recognize that every organization's goals are unique. Every organization's objectives are unique, which is why ITL refrains from providing a set of rules. Okay. It provides recommendations which as an organization, you can modify it or you can follow it as it is. So it's completely flexible in nature. So this has been one of the major reasons why ITIL has survived for so long, and why ITIL continues to be, very relevant in 2021, because it is not a set of rules. It's not a standard. ITIL is not a standard. Many people refer to ITIL as a standard. It's not a standard because standard needs to be followed as it is, whereas recommendations can be molded according to your needs. So these guidelines are recommendations for managing the IT within an organization. They're non-prescriptive in nature. Now, again, What do we mean by non-prescriptive? What is prescriptive? Let's look at it. Prescription means, so if you go to a doctor, yeah, I'm going to use a analogy of a doctor here. If you go to a doctor, he writes you a prescription. That prescription can only be changed by the doctor himself, no one else. Why? Because whatever he has written, the medicines that or the treatment the doctor has recommended has to be followed as it is. That's a prescription. Prescription means it cannot be changed. ITIL is non-prescriptive. ITIL never tries to say that you have to follow. ITIL says these are the guidelines. If you wish to follow, it is entirely up to you based on your organization needs. You can see what guidelines fit within the current scope of the work and you can modify them and use them accordingly. So they're very flexible in nature, highly customizable. ITIL is highly customizable. So that's a very brief about what ITIL is all about. ITIL is a set of guidelines or recommendation, a collection of best practices that we have collected from various different industries, and various people have contributed in the creation of what we refer to as ITIL. It is constantly evolving, and what we call as ITIL 4 has been evolved in the past 8 years from 2011 to 2019. Whatever changes have happened in the industry, all those changes have been taken into account, and we have, published the ITIL 4. Now, a question in the mind of many participants would be, how relevant is ITIL in 2021? So let's have a look at it, how relevant it is. See, today we have basically businesses from all sizes, from startups to large organizations. Every organization needs some guidance on how to run their business. ITIL helps provide this guidance irrespective of the size of the organization. So whether you're a startup or whether you're a Fortune 500 company, because of the nature of ITIL, ITIL remains relevant for every organization. It's a global standard for best practice. So to give you some indication, as I mentioned just a few minutes back, there was a survey that was done, and almost 90% of the top 500 companies use ITIL as best practice to run their IT operations. So, as I said, it is invaluable to an organization, whether you're a startup or whether you're a Fortune 500 company. ITIL becomes the fundamental and provides you with the basic that you need as an organization to run your business. So, irrespective of the size of the organization, irrespective of what kind of challenges an organization is facing, ITIL remains relevant, both as an organization and as an individual. As if I talk about from an individual perspective, ITIL remains one of the most sought after certifications and training, even in 2021. So we have seen a huge spike, especially after the release of ITIL 4, in the interest the people have, both as an organization and as an individual, in ITIL training and certification. Every organization is expecting their people to be certified on ITIL. So if you go for an interview or if there is a job requirement, many organizations expect you to be certified, but more on that later when we talk about the certification part. So another challenge that we are seeing currently is, especially in this pandemic time, how do organizations scale up? How do organizations, uh, you know, scale their business in this pandemic environment where everyone is working from home, and there are variety of challenges that we are facing in this pandemic, both as an organization and as an individual, that we have never faced before. How does ITL help us in today? So the beauty of ITL is because it is not a set of rules. It's always been flexible, uh, irrespective of what kind of challenges we are facing, including the current challenge of the COVID-19, in which organizations are having to reshape the way they deliver the business, the way they handle the clients. ITL remains relevant, and in fact, there is a much more need for organizations to reshape their businesses and realign and make the businesses more effective and efficient. ITIL as a framework provides the best practices and guidelines to make the same processes more efficient using automation and the guiding principles that we're going to be talking about shortly. So there is a plenty of guidance provided by ITIL that can be used, especially during this challenging time to reshape both as an individual and as an organization in 2021. Continuing on the topic of how relevant is ITL in 2021, there is an increased need for being agile. Every organization is talking about being agile. Our customers expect a faster turnaround time or a response time every every day, or I should say every second. Every day is maybe too long a time. Every second the business needs are changing. Our business keeps changing the requirements. So keeping in alignment with this changing business needs is one of the challenges that every organization faces. How to address this challenge, again, we're going to talk about that shortly. ITIL 4 has the answer to this, how to be agile, in which is one of the key needs in 2021. So ITIL 4 framework has been designed keeping all this in mind. It is very much in alignment with the agile best practices to address this very need, and therefore ITIL 4 remains very much relevant in 2021. Okay. How it does that, we're going to take a brief overview of that shortly. I'm going to give you an insight on what new things we have in ITIL 4 that helps us being agile. Right. So in ITIL 4, we have introduced a concept of something called a service value system. So ITIL looks at everything that we do in an organization from a perspective of an opportunity and demand and value. What do I mean by this? So ITIL has simplified that whatever we do in an organization, whether it is a new application that we're developing for a business, whether we are doing infrastructure support, or whether we are doing development work, service desk, incident management, n number of things, everything that we do can be broadly classified as either a demand from a customer or an opportunity that we see as an organization. Really, there is nothing else that we deal with. Do we deal with anything else? Just think about it. Everything that we do within an organization is either a demand from an end user or a customer, or it's an opportunity that we have identified as an organization. So it is that simple. This is the input that every organization receives. And the end objective of every organization is to create the value or deliver the value for the users or the customers. So, for example, like I said, let's say your input is a demand from a user, the demand being the development of an application. The value would be once the application has been developed and it is available. In between, we do variety of activities to convert this input into an outcome for the users. This system is being called or referred to as service value system. This entire system, its entire objective is to create value. Now here we have basically 5 different subcategories. One is the guiding principles. So ITIL 4 provides us with 7 guiding principles. These 7 guiding principles are generic guidelines or recommendation. As I mentioned earlier, ITL is full of recommendations or guidelines. There are no rules in ITIL. Okay. These recommendations again have been designed keeping in mind the agile need of the today's scenario. These guiding principles help an organization to adopt and adapt to the various needs, various changing business needs. Now, how it exactly does that? Of course, we won't be able to get into a detail of all these. I can give you an overview of what all we have in ITIL 4. But basically, these seven guiding principles are generic recommendations that can be used in any situation that an organization faces. Next, we have a set of 34 practices, best practices, right from change management, incident, problem. I'm going to show you a complete list shortly. So we have these practices. Practices are replacing the word process, which you may be familiar with. So if you're familiar with the word process, you can say there are 34 processes, but we are no longer calling them as processes and we are calling them as practice. Why it is so, I'm going to talk about that shortly. So we have 34 practices in ITIL 4 on how to convert these opportunity and demand into value. So seven guiding principles guiding us on how to convert an opportunity or demand into value. 34 practices. ITIL 4 briefly talks about governance, which is one of the most important aspects within every organization. Governance is how you manage or oversee within an organization at all levels. So ITIL talks about it briefly in the foundation. We don't go into the detail of governance at foundation level, but ITIL talks about the importance of governance, which is basically overseeing. So to give you a very small example to help you understand, let's say you have an IT security policy within your organization, which states that none of the employees of the organization are allowed to install any third-party applications on their laptops or desktops. This is an IT security policy. Now, if you have no governance or no way of overseeing or monitoring, you cannot be sure whether your employees are actually following this policy or they are not following. Similarly, in ITL, we have so many guiding principles, so much guidelines which you can implement. But if you have no system of monitoring in an organization on whether these policies are being actually followed or not, you can never be sure whether your organization is going forward or backwards. So you cannot know whether your employees are following a policy without governance. This is one small example. It goes, of course, much beyond that. So governance is a way of overseeing my entire organization, my entire operations, right from the top at a higher level to an operation level to ensure whatever policies, whatever guidelines, whatever rules that I've set are being followed or not. To give you another example, every country's government does governance. They lay down policies, they lay down the law, and then they have people who basically oversee to ensure that the policy is being followed. For example, you have a law that don't cross the red light on a street. You must stop on a red signal. How do you enforce that? You have governance in place. Either there is someone who's standing there to make sure that if you cross, he's ready to fine you right there and then give you a traffic fine, or there could be a CCTV camera that could capture the image and then send you. This is an example of a governance. Okay. Next, another important objective is continual improvement. Now, at the beginning of the discussion today, I talked about how business needs are constantly changing, and that is a challenge for every organization. Every organization has to constantly keep up with these constantly changing business needs. How do we address that? How do we evolve continuously? Well, ITIL 4 provides a continual improvement model, which is how to keep up with these constantly changing business needs. If we do not evolve as an organization, as an individual, we cannot survive. So continual improvement, if I would have talked about maybe 10 or 15 years back, it would have been about improving the quality, so on and so forth, but not anymore. When we talk about continual improvement in 2021, we are talking about the very survival of the organization depends on it. As an organization, if you do not evolve, you will not survive. We can name a few organizations, but I think everyone is aware of the top organizations in the industry. something like a BlackBerry or a Nokia. These companies were at the top of the game, but because they failed to evolve, because they failed to continuously improve, they could not keep up with the changing business needs. So ITIL 4 talks about how, as an organization, we can implement continual improvement. And then lastly, we have something called as a service value chain, which is a step-by-step process on how to convert this opportunity or demand into value. So this service value system that is there is very flexible in nature. It takes into consideration each opportunity and demand entering the system. And accordingly, there is a combination of these five components that you see. We choose a particular combination of these five components to create value. So this entire system is agile, it's flexible, it takes into account what opportunity or demand is entering, and accordingly we create a combination of these to convert value. This was a challenge in ITIL V3. We had a fixed way of converting every opportunity or demand into value, or a fixed path. So we realize we cannot have the same response to every opportunity or demand, because every opportunity or demand is unique. What works for one uh, requirement from a customer will not work for the next. So to give you a very simple example, let's say we had already developed an application for a customer, and we've got a requirement for a new application, which may be very similar in nature, but we cannot do what we did for the similar application in the past. We have to look at it fresh. As an organization, we have to be flexible. So how do we do that? By creating a unique combination of this. Now, we don't have we have limited time. We cannot get into the details of how exactly we do that. Of course, that is something you're going to learn in the training. Um, but yes, I'm just trying to give you a very high level bird's eye view of how the system helps an organization be agile. This is called as the service value system, and this is the heart of ITIL 4. I can say this basically covers all the components that you're going to be studying in the training. So one of the components of the service value system are the practices. Now, practices in the ITIL Foundation certification is about 60 to 65% of your entire course. This is where your majority of your focus would be. On the screen, you see the name of 34 core practices that are part of the ITIL 4. So you have availability management, business analysis, capacity and performance management, change control, incident management, IT asset management, monitoring and event management, problem release, so on and so forth. I can continue naming, but I would give you some time to just go through the slide to familiarize yourself with all the practices. Just take a moment to go through this. Now, I know some of you may be thinking what these practices are all about. So, yeah, um, these practices are basically how we address specific areas of IT service management. For example, change control talks about what are the best practices for making changes in an organization to your IT environment. Incident management talks about how to, what are the best practices for handling any service disruptions or interruptions or reduction in quality of services that we face in an organization. Similarly, asset management talks about how do we manage the IT assets in an organization, and so on and so forth. In foundation, we cover 15 practices. So all these 34 that you see on screen are not covered in the foundation. In ITIL 4 foundation training, we cover the 15 practices that you see on the screen, which is change control, incident management, IT asset management, monitoring and event management, problem release, service configuration management, service desk, service level management, service request, continual improvement, IT security management, relationship management, supplier management, and deployment. So these 15 practices are covered in the foundation certification. Why these 15 and why not the rest? Well, this is not decided by me or Cognixia or Collabra. This is basically how it has been set by the governing body. So we follow the governing body, which is the Excelos. Excelos is the organization who owns the ITIL. So they have come up with this syllabus, and we have to follow that, and we follow that. And these 15 practices are the core practices that every organization needs. So it is pretty much the basics. Everything is covered in the foundation. The next are covered in variety of next level of certifications, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Okay. All right. Let's move on. Now, some of you may be here who have already done ITIL V3 training, and you guys have come to see what are the differences between ITIL V3 and ITIL 4. So many of you may have the question in mind, what is the difference between ITIL V3 and ITIL 4? Okay. So I'm going to talk about at a very high level. Now, those of you who have not done ITIL V3, this is not applicable for you, but still you can just be with the discussion. You may get some insight. So people who have done ITIL V3, if you remember, there was a life cycle based approach in ITIL V3. We had something called as a service strategy. Next, we had service design, service transition, service operation, and continual service improvement. All this you would have studied in ITIL V3. All of this is gone. It is replaced by the service value system, which you just saw in the previous slide. So the entire life cycle has been replaced by this service value system. Now, why we have replaced this? Let's talk about that. See, in ITIL V3, one of the challenges was it was not very agile, and it did not have an end-to-end or a holistic approach. ITIL V3 followed a siloed approach. So strategy, people who are taking care of strategy only focus on strategy. Similarly, design only focus on design. And all of this works in an isolation. This was fine until we moved on to an agile environment wherein there is a greater need for teams and individuals to collaborate and focus on a high level and end-to-end delivery of value rather than focusing on very specific objectives. So ITIL 4 has a much more holistic approach that focuses on end-to-end delivery of value rather than following a siloed approach. The next change that we have is, as I mentioned earlier, the change management, incident management problem, all the practices that you saw in the previous slide. As you're familiar, earlier we used to call them as processes. Now we are calling them as practices. So why this change in the naming? Is it just a change in name? Well, yes and no. It is definitely a change in the name. We are calling them as practices now. The other difference we are trying to indicate by calling them as practice is a process is more or less fixed. So if I say there is a certain process for handling any issues that your customer is facing, if that process is fixed, that means irrespective of what issue the customer is facing, I will have a standard response to that. That is what a process is. A practice is depending on what issue the customer is facing, I will adopt to that need and accordingly respond. So practice, we can say, is much more intuitive, it is much more adaptive, it is much more flexible. A process is rigid. So this is what we're trying to indicate here. ITIL V3 focused only on the customer needs, whereas ITIL 4 focuses on needs of all the stakeholders, because we realize that it is not just the customer we have to deliver to. We have our internal stakeholders, we have our suppliers who we have to answer to, who we have to manage. Then we have our internal sponsors. variety of different stakeholders. ITIL 4 is much more comprehensive. Another major shift is ITIL V3 was in alignment with waterfall project management, whereas ITIL 4 is in alignment with Agile, DevOps, and Lean. So yes, that is a major shift that has happened. So we've already talked about that the life cycle based approach that we had from strategy to design, design to transition, transition to operation, and operation and then CSI. All this has been replaced by the service value system, which you just saw. ITIL V3 talked about delivery of value. Delivery of value means as a service provider, you are solely responsible for providing the services to the customer, and customer is only at the receiving end. There was no responsibility of the customers. Everything was the responsibility of the service provider. Now, this does not work in an agile environment wherein we need a better collaboration between both the service provider and a customer. The customer should have equal responsibility. For example, if you're developing an application, the customer has the responsibility of testing that application from time to time and providing the necessary feedback so that the service provider can improve on those. So ITIL 4 talks about co-creation of value. Co-creation of value basically means service provider and customer actively engage more in a partnership role rather than a service provider and a customer role to create the value that is needed for an organization. There were no guiding principles in ITIL V3. In ITIL 4, we have 7 guiding principles, and ITIL V3, we had 26 processes. We have introduced some new processes, so the total number now stands at 34. So at a very high level, this is the differences between ITIL V3 and ITIL 4. Now, I'm sure many of you will have questions regarding the upgrade and all those things. So I'm going to address those once we start the Q&A. So just hang tight. I'm going to talk about whether it is worth upgrading from ITIL V3 to ITIL 4. Is your certification still valid? All those questions will be answered. Okay. You can keep posting the questions. I'm going to address them, once I'm done with this shortly. Okay. All right. Let's move on. So next question people have is, I am into Agile or I'm into DevOps. How is ITIL different from Agile and DevOps? So some of the common myths include people think ITIL is more of a process, whereas DevOps is a separate team in a company. Well, so let me just clarify the difference between ITIL and DevOps. See, ITIL is a framework on how to manage your IT services within an organization. So when I say IT services, it includes anything and everything that you do within an organization, how to manage them better. Okay, ITIL is a framework or a set of guidelines for managing your services better. DevOps is a specific area, it's a philosophy of software development and delivery that aims at unifying development and operations. So, how to bridge the gap between the development and operations. That is what DevOps is. It's specific to software development. ITIL is a framework for managing everything. So we can say ITIL and DevOps are mutually exclusive. That means whatever you study in ITIL applies to DevOps. DevOps is not a part of ITIL, but the principles apply whether you're in DevOps, whether you're in Agile. They are not, they complement each other. They do not compete with each other. So there is no question of whether I should go for ITIL training or Agile or DevOps. These are all complementary to each other. They are not, there's no versus, like I put in the heading, there's no ITIL versus Agile versus DevOps. I've just put it to, make a point, but there's no competition between these three. They're all addressing completely different needs. ITIL is about overall management of the IT services within an organization. Agile, of course, is towards creating a flexible and faster response, and DevOps is how to, bridge the gap between the development and operation. What kind of role? Now, another question many of you will have is, what kind of roles does ITIL apply for? So it doesn't matter what role do you have. Whether you're a developer, whether you're into application support, project management, you're into agile, cloud computing, network, IT service manager, incident, problem, service desk, DevOps engineer, and many more. Any role you think about within IT, ITL is relevant. See, ITL is, like I generally say, is like learning the ABC. Now that you have become doctors or engineers, ABC is still relevant, right? Which we studied in our kindergarten or whatever, right? Similarly, ITL is like studying the ABC of managing the IT. Now, it doesn't matter whether you have become a developer or project manager or you're into cloud computing, you should know ABC, right? I can't think of a much more simpler example to try and help you understand why ITL is relevant for any role. Now, don't take my word for it. Just go and do some research. Irrespective of what role you apply, there would be a need, I would say, in 90% of the organizations where they would prefer someone who's certified on ITIL. I'm sure many of you would have already seen that, which is why many of you are interested in getting to know more about ITL and maybe get certified and trained on ITL because you saw that a role that you applied for or within your organization, there is a need for ITIL. Why do organizations prefer candidates who are either trained or certified or both on ITL? Because these are the best practices. Before you start working in different complex roles, it is important that you know ABC. Now, I know many people who have been working in the industry for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, they might think, oh, I've been working in the industry for 10, 15 years. Why do I need to go back to ABC? It's like, now I have become a doctor. Why do I need to still go back to the kindergarten and learn ABC? Well, yes and no. You may be using certain terms. Obviously, if you're working in industry for 10 years or 15 years or even 5 years or 20 years, it doesn't matter. Of course, you would be aware of many of the concepts that we will cover in the training. But the objective of the training is to give you a complete end-to-end objective. From my experience, and this happens very often, we deliver batches regularly, and we have people right from freshers who have just either joined an organization or they have not even started working to people with 15, 20 years of experience. And one of the common feedback that we see, especially from the people who have worked 15, 20 years, saying that, Anand, I thought I'll just attend the training for the certification because I wanted to get certified. I never had a chance to get certified, but I thought I knew everything that is there, but I still learned a lot of things that we are doing. And I learned new ways of doing the same thing, which is something that added value. Now that is the unique nature of ITL. You may be doing the same role for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but there is something new for everyone. So irrespective of what role you are, what kind of experience you have, ITL has something for each and every person. Yeah. So that's about the relevance of ITL for different roles because that's a very common question that we get. Now, coming to the certification, I am going to talk about first. So this is how the ITIL 4 certification scheme looks like. I'm going to go back and talk for the people who have ITIL V3 certification and they want to know whether their certification is still valid and all those questions. We're going to address that. So this is the certification scheme. Starting at the bottom, you have the ITIL Foundation training. So this is the basic training. Usually it is a 16-hour training. In this training, we cover the fundamentals of ITIL. We cover 15 practices in some detail, and we cover the 7 guiding principles, the service value system, all these things we cover in ITIL Foundation. And we also train you on how to crack the exam and do the mock exam and certification. All of those things are part of this. And yes, so this is the basic certification that is available. And it is mandatory for you to complete this before you move on to any of the advanced certifications. So foundation is for anyone and everyone who is, as I said, is in the industry, is in the IT industry, whether you're into technical or non-technical, the concepts will apply. Next, if you want to get into a bit more specialization, we have two basic verticals. We have an ITIL managing professional vertical, which is basically for people who are into, it's not for people who are into manager roles. People often think managing professional means manager. No, managing professional means anyone who has a certain mastery over ITIL. So in ITIL V3, we used to call it as an expert. We don't have a title of expert in ITIL 4, we call it as an ITIL managing professional. So this indicates that you have completed all these trainings and certifications, and you have not a mastery because it's a different certification. You have attained some level of expertise in ITIL. So this is for people who want to get into ITIL consulting, or they are into senior roles within an organization, manage different teams, and they want to do. Now, as an individual, you have after that various different choices. You can go into ITIL specialist, create, deliver, and support for people who are into operations. So when I say operations, that covers anything and everything from development to application support to incident management, change management, problem management, service desk, all those things. Everything that you do in an operations is part of create, deliver, and support. Drive stakeholder value is a certification that aims at managing the different stakeholders, how to whether they are internal or external stakeholders, how to provide value to these different stakeholders. High velocity IT is a specific certification for people who are more interested in driving Agile and DevOps related programs within their organization, or they want to understand how these ITIL processes, work in a high-paced environment. Then people who are into a strategic role, manager, senior manager, directors, senior directors, CEO of the organization, they want to create a strategy within the organization on how to, drive these ITL implementation. They can go for ITL strategists, and how to improve, basically how to do continual improvement in an organization. So these are four different trainings and certification. After you have completed foundation, these are available to you. You can do any of them. There is no rule that you have to do all of them, or you can do one, two. It depends on your requirement and needs. You can do all of them. It's up to you. Once you complete all of them, then you become eligible for ITIL managing professional. Separate stream is strategic leader, which has two certifications. One is the same, direct, plan, and improve, and then you have an ITIL leader. This is more aimed towards senior management roles, senior leadership people. This requires minimum of 3 years of experience in the industry. So it is not recommended for freshers, because obviously it is more aimed towards having focus on the leadership part of ITIL. Yeah, so these are the various certifications that are available. Of course, you have to start with foundation. So we're going to talk more about foundation. Now, people who have done ITIL V3, some of you would be wondering, okay, I did ITIL foundation in V3. How do I go? So unless and until you were an ITIL expert, or you had 17 credits in ITIL V3, if you have 17 credits, which means you completed all the 5 life cycle modules or these capability modules and foundation, and you had 17 credits, or you were an ITIL expert, if all of that is there, you need not do any of this what we discussed. You can skip this. You can directly do a bridge certification and jump to ITIL managing professional. So there is a benefit for you if you are an ITIL expert in V3 already. Let's say you only did ITIL foundation in V3 many years back, maybe few years back, you have to start again with ITIL 4 foundation. Okay. Is your V3 certification still valid? Yes, it is valid. But it is best to so a question very often is asked, is it worth upgrading? So it is just like when you have your old phone is working, but a newer model has come in the market. Okay, maybe that's not the best analogy because it is a choice. Your old phone is working, but upgrading to the new one will give you more features, right? Similarly, the ITIL V3 is still valid, but upgrading to the ITIL 4 will make you more relevant in the industry because organizations definitely are going to move towards ITIL 4. So it is recommended, but it is not a must. Okay. So whenever an upgrade happens, it is never a must. It is a choice. You can choose whether you wish to stay updated, stay relevant. You can make a shift. Yeah, that's it from my end for today. Thank you everyone for joining in. Have a good day and speak to you soon. Bye bye. Bye for now.